Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at the 5 most ridiculous and hilarious phonies that former North American champion and top Scrabble player Matthew Tunnicliffe has gotten away with at Scrabble tournaments. Now for those of you not familiar, phonying, or playing something that's not a valid word, is actually a very big part of the game even at the top level. Often players will deliberately try to play things that aren't valid words, hoping their opponent doesn't realize they're not valid and doesn't challenge, or is unsure and is too afraid to risk losing their turn and as a result leaves it on the board. Matthew is one of the best around, if not the best, at using this to his advantage and coming up with these very creative non-words that he's able to get away with. In some cases to win games, it seems that he has absolutely no chance of winning, and in other cases to save himself a lot of spread points by cutting his margins of defeat. In tournaments, reducing your margins of defeat is very important because point spread is the main tiebreak after amount of wins, and sometimes a couple spread points can make the difference between first and second place in a tournament. So with all that in mind, let's jump right into game number 1. In this game, he's playing against Peter Barkman, who's been a longtime Scrabble expert, and Peter's in a winning position here. It's Matthew's turn, but he's down 19. He doesn't have a very good rack here. He can't go out and score a lot of points, and Peter is threatening to play out with his tiles of D-E-O-R in multiple spots. He has, for instance, road over here making D-E, and he can also hook choir to make choired and play across with something like doer. Both of these outplays score a decent amount of points, so Matthew cannot score nearly enough to overcome these outs once Peter plays next turn. Or can he? Matthew finds the nice play of gipa, G-I-E-P-A, scoring 33 points and unloading all of his tiles except his eye, making 4 overlaps above Charles. The only problem here, as you may guess from the theme of this video, is gipa is not a word. It really doesn't even resemble anything that is a valid word. It's almost as if Matthew just strung together his tiles in any possible way that would be phonetically acceptable. And it turns out, though, this was a very creative decision. And as Matthew explains in his commentary here, basically what he's doing is he's taking advantage of the fact that Peter is very low on time, and he's hoping that Peter more or less panics in this position and either doesn't process the fact that this isn't a word or realizes it's not a word but somehow thinks he can still win. And that's basically what ends up happening here, miraculously. So if Peter lets this stay, then his best outplay seems to be playing road over here, R-O-D-E, next to the D in dismaying. But the problem is this would actually tie, because that would score 12, and then after getting the extra 2 points from Matthew's eye, it would be a tie game at 464. However, Peter can still win by letting this play stand. He has to not go out, but play something like node over here under choired. This would win because it scores 26 points, and that would put Peter up by 12 by score 476 to 464. Matthew's best play would be to go out with his eye over here, making git and ti. That would make it 476 to 470, and then after getting the 2 points from Peter's rack, Peter would still win by 4, 476 to 472. So Peter can actually still win after letting this play stand, but as Matthew mentions, Peter has under 9 seconds on his clock. So very, very hard, if not impossible, to process all that in that short an amount of time. And indeed, this gambit works. Peter does panic, and he probably does realize that going out ties, and he feels like, I should be winning this game, so he instead tries to not go out and use a similar tactic to node, but unfortunately his play of required here doesn't score enough. So he only scores 19. Matthew does go out with git and wins by 3. So really, really crazy finish to this game. I can't imagine that I would have ever been able to come up with a play like gipa. I probably would have just played something like peek there, P-E-A-K, and taken my loss. So major credit to Matthew for finding something like this. And you do have to feel for Peter or whoever his opponent is, but you know, it's just part of the game, and you do have to hand it to Matthew. That's a really creative play, and it's very tough to take advantage or handle these situations under time pressure if you're the opponent. So let's move on to our second example here. It's Matthew playing Yuri Pivovarov, who's another strong, longtime expert player. In this position, Matthew is once again in a losing position. He's got AEIIRT, but Yuri is up 12 points and will be playing out next turn since he's threatening to play Sake over here, S-A-K-E, hooking the S to make Fs, as well as Sakes to this S in Edacious. And Matthew doesn't really have a way to block both spots. He could try to play something maybe down here from this Y. He could play something like Airt, A-I-R-T. But the problem is Yuri is just going to play something like Stake through that T or hook Airt to make Airt. He cannot stop Yuri from having a valid outplay on the next turn. So instead what Matthew tries to do is similarly to what we saw in the last game, he tries to induce Yuri to panic and make a mistake. And the way he does that is rather insane. He extends the word tet to make tettiart, T-E-T-I-A-R-T. And yes, you guessed it, that is very much not a word. And his logic here, as you can see, is quite creative. Both he and Yuri are very low on time, and he's hoping that Yuri basically just fixates on this word that Matthew just made and panics and hooks an S on this word, playing tettiarts and sake to go out. Of course, if this happens, Matthew will very eagerly challenge because tettiart is not a word, and tettiarts is also most certainly not a word. So if this happens, Yuri will lose his turn, and then Matthew will play out next with something like tie over here, winning the game easily. So very clever play, and he's hoping that, once again, that Yuri puts an S on tettiart. The only problem is Matthew did not block Yuri's spot, which he had before, of Fs and sake, and Yuri, to his credit, very smartly, ignores the phony of tettiart, and just plays out with Fs and sake here, securing the win by 15 points. So, very valiant effort by Matthew, extremely creative, but also credit to Yuri for sensing the trap, and he couldn't risk challenging, because if he somehow challenges tettiart and it's a word, then Matthew will win. So if he's not 100,000,000% sure that it's a phony, then he made the right call to let it stand on the board. But still, very well handled by both players there. But great effort by Matthew to try to steal the game with that absolutely ridiculous phony. Let's move on to our third example. Here he's playing Jackson Smiley, who's one of the top players in North America. Jackson's in a completely winning position here. Matthew is down 68 with no bingos available, and Jackson's got a pretty nice rack in the endgame. So Matthew realizes he can't win this game, but he decides rather than just play something standard like gem and elm over here in the corner, he decides to spice things up a little bit by extending white to form gum white for 51 to the triple. Now, gum white, of course, is not a word. It's absolutely ridiculous, but the problem is here, Jackson, unless he's 100,000,000% sure this is not a word, he can't challenge. Because if Jackson challenges and it's good, Jackson will lose his turn, and then Matthew can play out with the word teen up here, making several overlaps of T-A-E-D, E-L, and N-E, and that'll win the game very easily. So Jackson, being not entirely positive that gum white is phony, as Matthew noted in the commentary, Jackson is pretty much positive, but he had enough doubt that he decided to let it stay on the board, and he just plays Visa over here to secure the win. Matthew, of course, goes out and cuts his loss to 34. So this play did not get Matthew the win, but it still saved him quite a lot of spread points, and that could very much, again, mean the difference between a place later on in the tournament, so extremely creative play there. Let's look at this example. Here he's playing David Engelhart, another strong player, and Matthew's in a bad position here. It's not quite an endgame like we saw in the other games where the bag is already empty or basically empty. There's still about 10 or 15 tiles left, but this board is really bad for bingoing. There's not a lot of places to bingo, and Matthew is down 44, so he's not in a good position. A standard play might be something like maybe par over here, making Oda and Air, trying to set up the N hook to make Airn. That would be reasonable. There's a lot of plays that are okay here, but there's nothing that exciting, and none of these plays appealed to Matthew. Instead, he decided that he would prefer to bingo in this position, because why wouldn't you want to bingo? You're you're down, and it's a great way for you to get back into the game. So that's exactly what he does, and he bingos with tarpaneer. Tarpanier from this TA already on the board as a 9-letter bingo. Now, tarpaneer, you guessed it, is not a word by any means, but it's a very creative phony. It puts David really in a bind here because very few players who aren't the top players in the country study nines. And David is a strong player, but certainly not one of the top players. So Matthew has every reason to expect David has not studied any 9-letter words. So while this word looks extremely suspicious, David probably wouldn't really know for sure that it's not valid. And from David's perspective, if he somehow challenges and it's good, then all of a sudden Matthew is going to probably start pulling away with this game since he'll be up 30 plus another turn. Whereas if David accepts, he can still go ahead and play all over here and keep the game tied, and David probably felt that he was better off doing this. Now, as it turns out, Matthew would go on to win in an endgame here by 13 points, so this ended up being an amazing play by Matthew, sort of taking advantage of the tough spot that it put David in, being that he couldn't really risk challenging without leaving himself very vulnerable to Matthew running away with it. That being said, of course, Matthew ended up winning anyway, so very, very tough loss for David here, but difficult challenge, and all the credit to Matthew for coming up with this ridiculous but also brilliant phony to steal this game. And now we have our final example here, guys. This is probably Matthew's most well-known and famous phony of all time. Here he's playing Lisa Barahovich, who's a very strong expert. This was at a national championship. And Matthew is down 70. He's got a good bingo rack. And one of his playable bingos might be something like epilates from this E in uridines playing down here, or penalize through this E to score a couple more points. But the problem is either of these bingos score in the low 60s, and Matthew will still be down a little bit. With it being Lisa's turn, she should be able to win in the endgame with a play over here on the right next to Matthew's bingo pretty easily. So Matthew realized all this, and none of these options appealed to Matthew. So what he decided was he needed to do something else and score a lot more points than either of these options. And the way he did that is absolutely insane. He bingos with spamelias as a disconnected 10-letter bingo through the A, M, and the L. And he scores 82 points with this play. And this play is absolutely bogus. I don't even know how he comes up with these words. It's actually remarkable how he comes up with them. But in this case, he puts Lisa in a bind, because now if she challenges and somehow it's valid, then Matthew with his O is of course going to just play out and win the game easily, given he's now in the lead. So Lisa has to do some math and try to figure out, okay, can I let this play stay on the board and still win the game? Now, it turns out in this case, the answer barely is yes. And to her credit, Lisa did figure this out during the game and accepted the play and played threes to this blank S for 27 points. Matthew proceeded to play his best outplay over here of O and Op, and Lisa held on to win the game by a single point. So a genius play by Matthew there, hoping that at the minimum Lisa would have to accept it and concede back a lot of spread points, and maybe somehow Lisa would even make a error in the endgame thinking that she could win when she really couldn't, and somehow miss threes and make a suboptimal play, and Matthew could even potentially steal the game. But like I said, a lot of credit to Lisa for staying calm after this ridiculous 10-letter word was played and double-checking her math and making sure she could still win by one. Of course, nobody who's not maybe Nigel Richards is going to know for sure that something like this isn't a word, because very few, if any, people have studied their tens. So extremely difficult challenge like that with the game on the line. Cannot blame her at all for just taking the sure win. But great play by Matthew to garner back a few spread points. Losing by one is far better than losing by 40 or 50 or however many he would have lost by if he had bingoed with something else. So there you have it, folks. Those are Matthew Tunnicliffe's 5 most outrageous phonies that he's gotten away with in tournaments. I hope you enjoyed that video, and there's a lot more equally outrageous phonies played by Matthew as well as other players. So if you enjoyed this video, I can definitely make some more content like this. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.